Hello, scholars. My name is Ira McIntosh, and this is Hypothesis. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my office. It's time for another episode of Hypothesis. I hope you're in for a doozy of an episode today because we are digging into philosophy. We're also talking about the problems with traditional academia and education systems. We're talking about giving students space to interrogate their assumptions. We're talking about how to use pop culture to teach philosophy. So it's a really exciting podcast today. I hope you're ready to think hard, to dig in, to enjoy, because honestly, we talk about cartoons and philosophy, and you will probably not have thought about those two things in the same sentence before. So I'm really excited to bring you along on this journey because it's been a great time. I've actually been thinking about this a lot, and I go into this in the episode. But one of my favorite authors right now is that's okay. I can edit this. I don't want to keep. I don't want to stop. Um, So let's use the summer as a chance to dig in and learn something new rather than just sitting in front of our televisions all day, every day, sweltering in the heat. Not speaking from personal experience here. My guest today is Anthony David Vernon, who is an adjunct professor of philosophy from and teaching in South Florida. He is a generalist, but is trying to focus his research on disability studies and has worked for multiple nonprofit organizations assisting individuals with special needs. Everyone, please welcome Anthony David Vernon. Zoom needs to get it together so I can stop guessing where things
They need
are.
a more stable UI system. And that
Exactly.
can also that can mess with a lot of accessibility needs because it's like people get used to certain functionalities. And there's nothing wrong with like updating a website, especially if you can make things more accessible. But oftentimes one of the things they're very bad at is like introducing rollouts. And it would be nice if there were certain features where like you could say that you have accessibility needs and then like you would get like the early trial versions of this sort of stuff. But no,
Yeah.
because that would not be
That makes
maximally
too much sense.
profitable. Well, it's just not maximally profitable. There's a lot of
Yeah.
times where uh, profit and accessibility don't go hand in hand. But rants against Zoom
Yeah.
aside,
I mean, I grew up in Seattle, and my family used to do beta testing for Microsoft back in the days where they would actually like make you come into the headquarters and like sit you down in a room and be like, this is the new software, try it out for us. And that was crazy, but they obviously don't do that anymore because in a post-COVID world, everything is done online. But anyway, may as well move on from complaining. I always like to start out a little bit by asking if you could talk just a little bit about your academic background and why you're in academia and your degrees and how all of that kind of fell into your life.
yeah, I mean, I'll be quick. I don't think I have a very interesting story about it, but I'm currently an adjunct professor at two South Florida institutions where I teach intro to philosophy. I kind of fell into philosophy because I'm interested in way too many things, and philosophy is a good subject if you are interested into way too many things. Um, in regards to what I'm doing in academia, I have no idea. But if I can draw any good out of it, at least right now, I try to at least focus some of my research on disability studies and at least some of my communication on disability studies, despite being someone that I don't think would be categorized as having, nor would categorize myself as having a disability. none the less, right? There's a lot of reasons why disability studies is personally important to me, and I've had a lot of interactions with disabled communities. And so, as a result of just my interaction, that's the area that I can help out with, right? Like, hopefully, like bridging that sort of gap between individuals who have no interactions with individuals with impairments and individuals who have impairments, and also that bridge for individuals who themselves are not impaired, but may want to do something, because it can be very sometimes uh, pressureful, and for good reasons, to like not want to step into communities that aren't your own, right? Or to not want to speak for
Mhm.
communities that aren't your own. And so what I try to do is not try to speak for anyone, but do my best to translate notions and issues going on.
Well, and as I'm sure as someone in philosophy, you're very used to asking questions rather than assuming things. And that's a great
I hope.
position to be in. Yeah. Well, I mean,
I
I've
don't
been
know.
having
Maybe I
that
do assume a lot.
I've been having that conversation a lot recently where just I feel like philosophy is every single thing that we study ultimately is just a different language for discussing philosophy, even math, even science, music, poetry, etc. Everything is just a different language for philosophy. So I can't imagine being a professor of philosophy and having to discuss all of those things all the time and have your brain just constantly moving.
Well, I mean, that's kind of Heidegger's take, and there's some good like bureaucratic weight to it, because Heidegger talks about philosophy as the queen of the sciences, or the subjects, and that's kind of backed up by it being a PhD at the highest level, right? You get your
Mhm.
doctorate in the philosophy of X or Y. I mean, the way I try to run my classes is very much I try to pick topics of like relevant interest that you can actually do something with. So it's not to dismiss
Mhm.
the more abstract conversations. I just find that when I'm in gen ed classes at intro level, all right, guys, we're doing the very nature of the mind. Unless you like relate that to like people's psychology majors, that's a little bit harder. So
Yeah.
there is that balance. Like today, I did an online lecture on the basis of like AI propaganda, and brought up Fruit Love Island. So it's one of those things where
Mhm.
where it's that sort of sensibility, like, hey, I try to keep things like relevant enough, but obviously like still talking about like big sort of issues of like disinformation, misinformation, and I just try to do that again and again. And I think one subject that I'm the best at doing that with is the subject of disability, just because I do
Mhm.
wish I was at that point where I could literally just teach disability studies courses, but I am not at that point. And there's not a lot of disability studies in institutions, sadly, and I do think there needs to be more of it, because of how relevantly beneficial it is, not just obviously individuals with impairments, but how helpful it is for just society by and large.
You wrote about that in one of your articles, and I wanted to bring that up actually, because it's something that I try to to drill into people's heads constantly. Is that if you helping one person helps everyone. If you create new ways of understanding and new ways of getting information to people that are more accessible, even if it's just one person that needs a specific way, every single person is going to end up benefiting from that new way of understanding. So it's crazy to me that there's so many people in the world who just don't want to take that extra step uh for that person that might need to hear something in a different direction than everyone else, and and keep someone away from it, because ultimately it's going to benefit society as a whole. I mean, I thought about that when I was in music. We used to have to do master classes all the time, which is basically you present to another teacher who then has like works with you for 10 minutes on that thing in front of the classroom. And at first I thought it was such a dumb idea because it's just like, well, it's just another voice lesson in front of people. But then I realized, oh, but they're going to say the same things as my teacher in a different way. And I'm going to be able to understand it better because they'll come at it from a different direction. And it's so useful for everyone.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it would be nicer to have more of an academia if there was a better funding structure, or like, you know, those types of classes that have multiple instructors. I mean, those are great because they offer perspective, and you may be in a class where like one person's style works better than the others and the others does not. I mean, I think I have some luck on my end by being a little bit younger, that I can be like, hey, I'm only a decade older than you. I know some of the same stuff. So I have that sort of upside. But I do think like it would be nice to have like a more traditional soul working alongside. But a lot of the topics I try to teach on are that sense of like, hey, like, have you considered this other perspective, and like using philosophers and philosophy to do so? So I do think one of the issues at hand, that we have oftentimes with philosophy settings is that we refer to the canon. I'm very much anti-canon thinking in many cases. There are some subjects obviously need a canon, but I don't think philosophy or certain avenues of writing. Like, I do think if we're talking like English as in like the study and the development of the English as a language, okay, that, yes, you need a canon. But like if we're talking about like creative writing, or we're talking about like analysis classes of language, no. A philosophy, same thing. And so for me, like, your typical philosophy classes get very Kant heavy, very Plato heavy, very Descartes heavy. Great. I like these guys. I think they're great, but I try to shove in figures that are relevant to particular topics. So students end up with a lot of more obscurant figures. They miss out on like the canon in my class, admittedly, for all of its weaknesses. But I hope they derive the strength of, oh, thinking deeper about homelessness, about AI, thinking deeper about disability, thinking deeper about charity, thinking deeper, about immigration, right? Using these sorts of things and showing that there's philosophy in these daily subjects. And that's because I think it's very easy to just take the sort of like, the mainstream consensus view of things when you're not being very philosophical. And everyone can, I think, benefit, as you were putting well, from having another mode of perspective to be able to operate from. Just like, even when you're listening to that other guy getting a critique in the master class, you yourself can go, shit, doing the same thing.
Literally. Well, and I even remember back in my undergrad, I went to a small private Christian school. And so we had a core set of classes we all had to take. We had core 150, 250, 350, etc. Core 150 was church history and stuff like that, which was annoying. And then 250 was all philosophy, and then 350 was applied ethics. And that was insane as a what? I must have been 19 taking applied ethics. But the philosophy course was taught, all of the other ones were taught by a singular professor, but the philosophy one was taught by three professors, and they would
Oh,
take
wow.
turns teaching it. And they were three of the like professors that had been at the school for like 30 years. So not only were we getting philosophy, but we were getting like school history at the same time, which made it more interesting. But the reason I bring it up is I remember the whole time sitting there, we had to read Plato's Republic. We had the portion about the cave, not the whole thing. We had to read Descartes. We had to read Aristotle. We had to read Hobbes and Locke and all of these other people because it was America. So you have to read John Locke. If you don't, then you don't understand the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But we read all of these people, all of these typical people, and then at the end of the semester, they were like, by the way, there are these three Eastern philosophers that basically came up with all of these things that we
Right.
talked
They
about.
get shoved in.
Yeah, and then it was like Avicenna and two other people, and they were like, by the way, they all came up with these ideas way before everyone else. And I was just sitting there like,
Why
why
didn't we
didn't we
just
learn
talk about
about
them?
them then? Why are we learning about the copy when we should be learning the original, and not just the original, but from a different viewpoint than our own, because we were from the global north. We were from the European world rather than the Asian world, the East Asian, the West Asian. Like, they have a completely different perspective on the world because of where they are geographically and the things that they're dealing with in their lives, especially back in BCE times. Like, they're completely different issues, so they're going to be explaining things in completely different ways. So why are we not talking about them more, other than the like last day of class on the last slide? And it made me
Yeah,
so mad.
I think for me, I get very random with it. Like I don't because I'm running through ideas. I don't really run through the history of philosophy. So what ends up happening is that it'll be like it'll include just various thinkers that I think are relevant to a particular topic. Or sometimes there are rare lectures where I don't include any figures. Um, but for the most part, right, it'll be, for example, if I'm going to talk about thanatology, okay, we're going to have Montague and we're going to have Zhuangzi in the same thing, right? Because they are of equal weight together, because it doesn't matter who came where and when and what. Like, if Epicurus and Zhuangzi and the Buddha can, help me explain something about death to students in a way that's like relevant or interesting to them, then I don't care what tradition I'm drawing from. And maybe that's a little too postmodern of me, but I think students vibe with it because it's not like, because that could be a little bit like dismissive, where it's like, all right, here's our
Mm-hmm.
feminist thinkers, and here are our, like, so I will like reserve time for feminist thinking, but it's not like that's the only time I'm going to mention women. That would be a slap in the face
Yeah.
to my classrooms that have more women than men, because that's the point we're at in American education. So if I'm just going, oh yeah, here's the woman week, no, fuck that. Like, Ayn Rand is going to show up, Angela Davis is going to show up, Simone de Beauvoir is going to
Mm-hmm.
show up in a different, a different context. Diotima is going to show up, right? Like these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of things to me are annoying when it's like, okay, so we have to follow this like particular route. And it's not to say that the canon's inherently bad. I'm only anti-canonical because so many people are focused on that particular method, that particular mode and style. And as a uh, disability study scholar, like, of course, I see a lot of that literally architecturally narrow-minded or intellectually narrow-minded people trying to shove everyone in the same pathway. And it's like, no, when you offer other routes, other avenues, and when you offer ramps, when you offer elevators, when you offer e-readers, when you offer closed captions, people go, ah, sweet. And so for me, it's like, why wouldn't we apply that sort of style of thinking to all of our settings, right? Like, why aren't we more multimodal in our day-to-day life? And I think we are, thanks to like certain technologies, for better or for worse, like being technologically ingrained, not that technology is being accessible. But yeah, the one of the biggest issues with higher ed, it's not adjusting to the necessary and increasing multimodality in life, and it's caught in a sense of like an antiquated, like, all right, well, Plato's cool, and like I read Lao Tzu once.
Yeah, I mean, I even remember asking at one point, I was just like, are there even philosophers now? Just because all of the philosophers we were taught about were at least 1,000 years ago, or I guess at least like 500 years ago. And so I
Yeah.
was just like, what are we supposed to take from this? Like, are we not thinking deeply anymore? And so I started digging into it and realizing that of course there's still philosophers, of course there's still these great thinkers that are existing among us, and writing and speaking and oration is still a thing, but it's taken new forms, and forms that are much more accessible. Like, I tend to think about like good stand-up comedy as a form of oration. Like, think of like Hannah Gadsby. She's not just a comedian. Like, that is oration, that is philosophy, just in a way that is really accessible. Or Um, I've been reading a lot of queer literature recently, and realizing that, I mean, myself as an ethnographer, realizing that someone's experience and someone telling their own experience can be philosophical in nature as they're kind of mulling over their lives and considering what they've been through and what it means for them and for others. And so it's interesting to really realize that we are just constantly surrounded by philosophy, and we're constantly surrounded, I mean, we're humans, we are always asking bigger questions that we can find answers for. So
Yeah.
it's frustrating that we're locked into, like you said, locked into that canon of authors from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, and this isn't to hate on academia. I have my criticisms, but not hatred, right? Like I'm not going to be like some charlatan that's like, okay, now go and buy my course. No, like,
Yeah.
and I've even like, have been in spaces with like course selling people, and I get it to some degree, but and these questions of like sophistry versus charlatanism, but the academic space does provide a lot of usefulness. It shares a lot of interested minds together. It is an institution that has institutional knowledge, right? It works people through like challenging ideas. Like there's a lot of good things. The issue at hand that academia needs to deal with is the fact that like before, if you wanted certain types of information, you had to go to that institution, right? If you wanted certain forms of knowledge and certain access to knowledge, you had to go to that institution. Now that you don't, why is the institution acting as if it has secret knowledge that nobody else has? No, what
Mhm.
academia has is people who are who are critical thinkers, who have access to a certain way of systematizing the knowledge, handling the knowledge, working with the knowledge in spaces with other people who give a crap about knowledge. And that's what academia should be pushing on. It's that sense that, look, I'm weirdly enough very pro bias. Like obviously, like I want to make sure my bias corresponds to reality, but I think it's stupid to go, ah, yes, my bias-free professor. No, I tell my students all the time, like I got heavy biases, and you are more than welcome to disagree. You'll never be, graded for a disagreement on a subjective basis. If you're saying like, hey, the Earth is flat, okay, that's a different, that's a different problem.
We might
But
need to send you to a different class to deal with that one, but
yes, we might need to have you talk with the astronomers and the physicists and the anyone who studies light refraction or just anything. But the in a general sense, it's like, and I do very much like the ethnographic process as a response to the way things are moving. Would ethnography have worked,
Mm,
as well in the days where academia literally was the gates where knowledge was? Maybe not as much, but in the era where like everyone has access to all the same information, more or less. I mean, there are some paywalls here and there, but you know,
mhm.
in a relative sense, people are near equals. Like as Hobbes talks about it, where it's like, oh, people are near of mind. It's like, well, we're near of information as long as you have access to a good internet connection. In that sort of realm, what needs to be switched is the sense of that academics are individuals who are better at synthesizing perspectives, conveying perspectives that are novel, right? Like there needs to be a more inventive side to academia and allowing students to confront things that are novel to themselves and their experiences. If we are no longer being like, hey, here's information you've never confronted before, then we need to instead get people pushing with information, right? As we get more, and in that pushing of information, so often the style and the format is very much like, okay, well, here's reading, here's me talking about it. And you have no input, you have no say, you have no other ways of getting to it. Like, this is how it's going to be done. And it's like, no, like, there needs to be that sort of sense where students have options in how they convey, with that information, because our goal should be, hey, are you in this space to gain something you would have otherwise not gained by not being here, as opposed to, hey, here's important information. How are we to deem what's important when individuals have access to it all?
I have really started noticing this huge shift in academia and how it's functioning just within the last few years, honestly. Like even when I was in undergrad and my first master's back in the 2008 to 2014, it was still very kind of authoritarian. Like you listen to us, you take this in, and then you leave, and that's it. And in that sense, you're right, where that's where ethnography and anthropology really was not helpful because you had academics going into societies and telling them what they were doing rather than listening and learning from them and then translating that for everyone else. You had people going in and being like, oh, so you're going to do this, let me tell you what the labels are for that, and let me tell you about yourself. And that's not how that's supposed to work. But I have really started noticing this shift into what you're saying, into asking deeper questions and getting students to think critically. And I think that's why all of a sudden we're seeing so many news stories about students who are trying to get their teachers fired and like saying, oh, well, you clearly disagreed with me on my paper, so therefore you're a terrible person and I hate you because you're trans, so therefore I'm going to get you fired, and get this all over the news. That kind of stuff, because people like that are coming from families who expect academia to be authoritarian and are expecting their viewpoints to just be regurgitated to them and to not have to think critically, because that's what academia has been for so long. And now that it's not that as a whole, there are still some of those holdovers, and fingers crossed in 15 to 20 years they'll be gone and we'll have a new system in place. But because professors are getting students to think critically, the ones who come into that space expecting to not have to do that are reevaluating in real time and realizing that they're in the wrong place and trying to change the space for their own specific needs, rather than understanding that there are other people around them and that them thinking critically is going to help the whole system.
Yeah, I mean, a couple, I think, IRL examples of what you're talking about. So, uh, I wrote an article on the idea of homeless versus unhoused, and it's making an argument
Mm,
that we should use both terms, right? Because when you go into, spaces, ain't nobody calling themselves unhoused. I have
mm-hmm.
never heard anyone refer to themselves as unhoused. So, when I'm talking to homeless people, they're homeless, right? Because you want you that's the label you're going by. I'm not going to impose some sociological public health label. However, what I will do in certain spaces is use the term unhoused educationally in public health settings and sociological settings because the context is appropriate there. And I do think that each of these words can be used to speak to a particular dilemma, whereas the homeless matters can be more phenomenological, more personal, more experiential, and unhoused can be more legal, these bigger, sort of frameworks, right? Using kind of both those terms. And I do see, yeah, a lot of times where academia can impose the way that people feel. And so a good example there, away from the homeless example, is the way I like to talk about countries in class. One thing that I like to do when talking about countries, I'm like, look, every country has done some shit. Every country has made some, errors, to put it mildly. So it's like if I'm gonna say some things that are not good about the United States, that doesn't mean the French get off. That doesn't mean China gets off. That doesn't mean Iran gets off, right? And I obviously don't mean all the people, but it's this sort of sense that sometimes if I say something good or bad about a country, there'll be the responsiveness of, oh, but what about this? It's like, yes, right.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of times like
Yes, and
I avoid a lot of these problems of like, oh, well, you're just disagreeing with my opinion. It's like, yeah, I may disagree with your understanding, but like you have the space to convey your understanding, your sort of difference. And so for me, like let students be very open to disagreeing on whatever sort of topic is at hand, as long as they're not being intolerant, right? As long as you're not being
mm,
intolerant, you're good to go. Now, on the intolerance thing, kind of connecting all those points together, a lot of the legal systems in certain US states are not giving that sort of attitude that I give to students, right? I want to give my students the space to be like, hey, yeah, I have advantage of the world. You have advantage of the world. You know, I'm going to give you a perspective, maybe one you have or have not confronted, and then you work through, that perspective in your own. The state of Florida is like, no, we don't want certain perspectives. And somehow
Mm-hmm.
Texas is even worse. And so for me, like there are times where I'm teaching lectures that are technically illegal in my given state, the way I teach uh, uh, feminism, because you cannot say that certain groups are necessarily oppressed. Don't know what necessary oppression means, if that's like metaphysically or like through history, who knows? But it's these sort of things where it is a weird period where there seems to be holdout resistance to this emergent style of education that just by technological functionality has to be more democratic. And in that opening up of democratic education, sure, have certain ideological bands formed? Sure, right? Like I do understand the complaints around like, oh my God, everyone's a communist professor. No matter how real or not that is, the point being, I get the complaints and I do see why
Mm.
people see things that way. But the way you don't fix this sort of thing, if you do think commie education is a problem, you don't just start like banning the things because it emboldens us, right? Like anytime Florida says you can't teach that, I go, okay, how can I get around that and teach it anyways? Anytime Texas
Great,
bans
let's do
something,
it.
it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna fucking
Yeah.
teach that. And if that's what I'm fired over, good. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it is that weird sort of sense of like you see holdover pushbacks legally, institutionally, in social spaces, and I do think that there is a issue where we do need to make sure that our spaces are spaces where students can disagree, where they're not being indoctrinated, where they're not being pushed towards an ideology, in spite of the professor's potential, including myself, indoctrination or ideology.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's just the Socratic method. I mean, that's going back to the dawning of collegiate study, that the teacher, instead of, like I was saying, instead of just being an authoritarian figure at the front of the classroom saying, here's your information, learn it, move forward, you are engaging the students in conversation. You're inviting them to not just raise their hands to ask questions that you tell them the answers to, but you answer their questions with more questions and get them talking and guide that conversation, which encourages critical thinking. But again, critical thinking is dangerous to an authoritarian state. And especially in the United States, they prefer a proletariat that is easy to coerce.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, but it's not just a U.S. issue to be fair though, because it's
oh,
like
true.
every nation state's history textbooks are nationalistic. So
Mm.
it's a global thing of like there is no history book that is not in favor of that nation.
I mean, one of the examples that I turn to a lot in my own education is, again, back in undergrad in the core 350 class, the applied ethics course. We had like, the way that it was set up was, it was one of the big like 150 person classrooms, and then you were also assigned to a small group of like 10 to 20 students with a different professor, and that each group was a specific subject, and all of the subjects that I wanted when I was signing up for class were all taken, and they were all the fun subjects, and the only one that was left was US foreign policies in the Middle East. And I was just like, I do not want to take that class, but I have to because it's the only section open anymore, so I guess that's the one I'm taking. And at that point, I grew up in a house where my mom was Jewish and my dad was Presbyterian, so this was, back then I was still pro-Israel because I didn't know better, because that's, my mom raised money for the creation of the state of Israel, and that's what it was. And that the professor for that section of the course was Palestinian, and he was so gracious. I honestly should find him and write him an email to tell him all of this, but he was so gracious in letting me push back that entire semester. Every time he would say something, I'd raise my hand and be like, but this and this and this and this, because of my background, and I didn't know any other perspectives. And so I was just constantly, basically, that section turned into me and him arguing, and the rest of the students all kind of taking notes. And I came out on the other side, not necessarily pro Palestine at that point. I am now, but at that point, I came out able to question and have those critical, constructive thoughts with myself, and be willing to look at sources that disagreed with me, because I had that situation with a professor who was very willing to let me disagree. And I think that's an important part of education, and important and an important part of the
Oh,
academic cycle. Like, and expanding how you think, you have to be able to argue and argue
yeah.
constructively, not just argue to for argument's sake, but argue constructively, and push back and say, okay, great, but what if we thought about this in a different way? And that's the only way that things ever move forward.
Yeah, it may sound like the most basic thing that I'm going to say, but and I say this as un Latino. My name doesn't show it, pero yo soy un cubano. But in all that, you have the, the kind of the tendency, right, in highly Hispanic communities as not being the most aware of gender and sexual issues. And so when I have sometimes taught on, feminist ethics, right, I, start from a very important place, and that would be Ruvar's, becoming of a woman. And what does that even mean? And so, in order to do that, you have to separate sex from gender. Not that she was that aware in doing that, but scholars reading off of her, like Judith Butler, have done that, and it's had massive effects in modern
Mm-hmm.
feminist ethics. And so, showing students like here is sex and here is gender, right? Because they're going to expect me as the kind of quote unquote, yeah, and I hate how this term has been appropriated, but thus is life. The here's the woke professor telling me biology is not a thing. It's like, no, here's sex, and here are the biological things. Here's male, female, intersex. There are hormones. There's sexual dimorphism, right? Like these, like we're not denying these things. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
biology, right? Like I'm like let's talk about what corresponds to reality. Like that's the biological stuff. And then here's gender, which can be, there are some studies about some anatomical aspects to gender in the brain, but that's it's still early studies, and obviously, funding has been reduced in the United States around that stuff for mysterious reasons, we'll say.
Weird.
Yeah, weird. Yeah, as soon as a fascist, gets in the well, a group of fascists get in the White House, but um, so these sorts of things, it's like, oh, sex and gender, and it's like, a lot of times when I'm teaching this, like, it's a lot of times students, it's their first time confronting that idea, or even
Mm.
confronting an individual that explains it in the way that I do, where it's like, no, like, I'm not denying biology, like what, like I got biology going on,
Yeah.
like so. But so it's interesting, and a lot of times students will, it's not that anyone's mind has changed. That's not my goal either, right? My goal is not to
Mm-hmm.
necessarily or inherently change minds. Like, hey, have you thought about it
these
this way? Could you
these are
see how
ideas
someone
that
could
have been
find this
presented.
useful?
Yeah.
Exactly. And a lot of students, as long as they don't say stuff out loud, because I do like a lot of write-ups, it's like, there's been students that I think would have said some things in write-ups where I'm like, where I do feel very disappointed in the way that the world is. But
Mm.
I think in some sense, would I rather that student not think that way? Sure. But in addition, am I glad the student feels comfortable enough to engage me with that stuff? Yes. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
sense of them being comfortable enough to engage me with that stuff shows a willingness to at least listen to somebody else's perspective on this stuff. And I think as academics, and I don't think it's always our fault fully. I mean, you have propagandists like Jordan Peterson that don't help, but this sort of sense of there is a lot of propaganda being like, hey, those academics inherently want to control you, make you think a certain way, make you want to understand the world X, Y, and Z way. And I've had conversations with these types of folks, and part of my doing that is like, hey, look, like we're not like
Yeah.
we're not all this way. Like we would like to welcome in more people to think in more ways about the world.
Well, and even further than that, just in a philosophical way, I think the even deeper question beyond gender and sex in that situation is who wants you to think about it in a very specific way, and why do you think they might want you to think about it like that? So even beyond like, i I don't care what you think about it. What I want you to think through, not you but in general, what I want people to think
Yeah.
through is who is asking you to think about it in a specific way, and what are their motivations for that. And if the you come back and say, oh, it's this person and their motivations are religious and capitalistic, great, then we're on the same page. If you come back with a different answer, then I'll ask more questions because I won't understand your logic and I'll want to know. But I think that's the underlying question, rather than, and it could be coming, that shift in questioning could be coming from me being tired of having that conversation at this point.
Yeah.
Like, that information has been out there since the 90s, the difference between sex and gender. So if you're not part of that conversation and you've never heard that before, then you might be living under a rock, and
No,
that's
no,
not,
no, but
it's
it's not
currently
about a
not my
rock. It
place.
because in certain backgrounds and certain milieus, the question would never come up. The
That's
question is
fair.
that sex is gender, right? Like and again, stereotypically, not universally, Latino communities, it's not even the question. And like the language
Mm.
itself is very gendered. Like, French is very gendered, right? Like the Romance languages are. So like sometimes
Oh,
this stuff can be
so
kicked
frustratingly
into
so.
the language itself. And so in that sort of, regard, most students don't even think of it as a question in my
Mm,
experience, right? And then if you ask, well, who would make you think this way? They'd go, nobody. It just is self-evident, right? And that's part of, I think, a lot of what we may fail in that sort of phenomenological gap where it's like we time due to our career to explore ideas, right? In the same way that someone who's a mechanic has had a way to explore cars that I'm never going to explore. So in that sort of regard, for something that's obvious to a mechanic, maybe silly to me in the same way that my thinking around disability or
mm.
homelessness or, metaphysics or aesthetics may be obvious to me. And then I talk to a student, they're like, wait, what? Wait, there's people who wait, and it's okay. Like, and that's that sort of thing. You have to meet people where they're at. And the thing that's I think easy also to forget about educational spaces, right, is that you're often sharing a space with individuals who actually do already know the material, right, in some sort of
Mm.
sense. With the same person who you know, is concerned about, how the Spurs are going to do in the Western Conference Finals. And not that, I'm not concerned about the Spurs also, but it's like it's that thing where it's very easy for us as academics to be pigeonholed and shoved into our own sort of like, okay, like this is our sort of world, and to be like, okay, but what are the actual worlds that people are living in? And while I can't enter every single space, dang, I try to be like get some sort of sense of like what's going on in all sorts of people's spaces, and you kind of have to do that once again with that massive available information, but while simultaneously realize that people aren't using the tool of the internet to actually garner that information, where it's like, hey, here here is something you could see yourself, could understand yourself, or something like it you've confronted. But going back to your earlier thing, who's making you think this way? Well, your specific algorithm has you targeted here. Your specific algorithm has you targeted here. And obviously, the powers that be want individuals in separate algorithms for these very
Yeah.
reasons. It's like, okay, well, hold up. Let's bring all these modes and these accessibilities
Hmm.
together, all these vantages, all these ways of entering in together, right? And this is in a sense like one of the things that lots of systems can learn from disability studies, because it is really the subject that cares the most about individuals being able to enter and participate in the same spaces.
That's something that struck me. I was recently, as I'm in the middle of applying to PhD programs and trying to go further with my education, I've been kind of reassessing how I think about things and how I come to conclusions and how I research and such, as a lifelong academic does, and realized for a very large portion of my life I was a very conservative Christian until I was probably 22, 23. um and I was all about theology. Like I loved apologetics, and I loved just I had an extra wide margin Bible that was, every single page was filled with notes, because I loved my concordance and I loved all just researching and cross-referencing and all of that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about it recently and realized one of the reasons I loved theology so much is because it comes with a set of base assumptions. So at a certain point, you don't have to ask questions because certain things are assumed. And it gives you this kind of false sense of comfort of, okay, at least we know this is true. And then we can build from there. But then once you're in philosophy, there is no base assumption. Everything has to be questioned. You have to take a step back. Literally every time you ask a question, there are 300 questions that come right behind it saying, okay, but why did you think that way? Where did you come from that? Like, what language did you use to say that, and what words did you choose in that question that created the thought, et cetera, et cetera. And then, because I'm in communications and sociology, you start talking about semantics and semiotics, and, well, are you talking about the actual thing, or are you talking about how you talk about that thing? And then it just, everything falls apart and everything becomes quarks and molecules and atoms, and you just never know when it ends. uh, and I sometimes miss that comfort of having base assumptions.
But we
but
can
but
also,
like you were saying,
yeah,
there are people that come to those spaces with those base assumptions that have never had to challenge them.
yeah, and in that sort of sense, right, in that important but to end on, I think some people also don't realize sometimes how philosophical um, they're being. So,
Mm.
for example, like just restarted my summer semester, and so far I've gone over AI and disability as two separate things. And one of the students, made a point about like the category of disability as a social thing. Like, okay, well, if it is a social thing, can we discover new disabilities? And that's like a fascinating question, because it's that sense of the answer is in some sense yes if it is social, but then the impairment is always there. So it's that they accidentally hit the point of like nominalism and realism without even knowing. And so for me, what's important is, look, I love if you have the technical terms, I love if you have the language for it, but like if I can spark that sort of line of thinking of like, oh, why do we refer to things the way we do? What allows them to hold their weight? And I do that through disability. Amazing. And I think that's one of the things that we have. It's that like we do want people to have the technical like layout. We do want people to sometimes have those like background assumptions in a field. I mean, philosophy is not free of them in many settings. I mean, just look at analytic philosophy. I think we sometimes forget as continentals how much of the uh, canon has assumptions in it. So it's, for me, it's important to go, yeah, I get people are coming in with assumptions. How can we use where people are at to either deconstruct those assumptions, if that's what's helpful with it for them, or to build something off of those assumptions? So, uh, last semester, I had a class that was heavily theological. Very random because it wasn't at the Catholic school I teach at, it was at the junior college. So that was unexpected. They were very fascinated by questions of faith and religion. And, um, in that sort of sense, like here I am as the agnostic, professor at the secular institution. Could I have gone, we're shutting this down because I want to talk about Sartre more? Sure. But the questions of radical free will sparked questions of like if God can grant free will or not. So
Mm.
let's pivot to that instead because it's still answering those same questions about determinism and free will and compatibilism. So it's like, okay, I was planning on using Sartre, but if we're going to stay on Ecclesiastes and do that, then that's what we're going to do. And so yeah, I do
And
think
there are
that's also
philosophers
important.
that do cover it in that language and in that way, and even from that time period. I mean, we have writings on those things other than the Bible, extra canonical writings
Yeah.
from 4000 BCE that discuss the same things and the same concepts, and I think people forget that too, just that there's, I mean, by for whatever reason, forget that. But they're Egyptian writings from the exact same time. There are Roman writings from during the occupation of what we would now consider to be Israel and Palestine and that region. When Rome was there, there were Romans who were there writing down what they were hearing and what they were seeing, and that's why I love histories, because we have so much that people just don't talk about. There's so much out there, and there's so many opinions, and there's so many real people, and uh, that's why I get frustrated when people are like, no, these are the philosophers that we talk about. We have to talk about Descartes and whether or not the soul is part of the body. We must discuss this. Okay, but there are also like hundreds of other people who have discussed the same concept in a very different way that might be a lot more
Yeah.
accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I when I got my bachelor's in history, that was kind of my thinking of like what's the thing that you learn the most from getting a history bachelor's? It's like the number of ways people have lived is astounding, right? The various ways in which people have used life. And to kind of, in a weird way, wrap that into the Descartes thing, when I explain mind-body uh, dualism for those students that are interested in psychology, right? So I'll do, if I have a lot of students that are psychology as their major, I do a philosophy of psychology class. And the way I explain mind body dualism is through anime. And I'll do it through like the Dragon Ball Z fusion, or and I'll have like a graphic that has Code Geass, Neon Genesis, and Chainsaw Man. Because these are instances where you have the mind being detached from the body. So like, the mind goes into like the in Puchiana and Chainsaw Man, its soul goes into Denji's body. In the fusion, right? The two minds form into one body. In Code Geass, the mind is shut off, but the body still operates. And in Neon Genesis, kind of this weird fusion of mind and body. So it's this sense here of like, it's hard to explain the concept, right, of mind body dualism because it's not, I argue it's not the most intuitive. And so, given its lack of, I think, intuitiveness, using anime, which has examples of this again and again and again, right, clicks for a newer generation. And I get it; it's hard for like the
Mm.
70-year-old professor to like figure out what the heck is happening in Chainsaw Man, and I have to be very mindful of not being outdated myself at some point. Um, and that is a difficult task to add on to the many tasks that professors already have. But one thing that could benefit and offload work for professors in this regard, if professors can teach from what they know, from what they understand, and take students' voices into account, well, then you have students covering some of the curriculum and you're teaching from what you know. And if you can bring these two things together, a mixture of, hey, you paid for my expertise, but you also paid to get something you're interested in, then you right there have a benefit of like students are going to get new perspectives that you know well and you're passionate about. And when you're passionate, students vibe with that because they can feel it in you. If they can tell that you don't give a shit, why would they give a shit? And if you're teaching on stuff from time to time that they care about, well, even if it's not the thing you're the most passionate about, they want to know about it. And I think that sense of like, you don't have to make a school setting entirely about the students or acquiesce to students if you really don't want to. Like that's fine and dandy and all, but you know, at least there should be spaces where it's like if you're a kant nerd, there are ways to like put kant into an intro setting. If you are a fan of Mencius, there's ways to put Mencius in an intro setting. If you're a fan of Fanon, put Fanon in. These things are possible. And I do think one of the struggles that can happen right now is you'll find many classes where you'll enter the class. It's like, well, that's what the textbook says, so that's what we're doing. And it's like, but you don't agree with the textbook. You
Yeah.
have a Deleuzian interpretation of Plato. What are we doing here?
Well, it's so important to realize the ways in which philosophy plays itself out in our daily lives, and cartoons are such a great way to see that. I mean, there's no big idea that's ever been proposed that doesn't make more sense when it's in a cartoon. Like there's a book that I read that really kind of shifted my whole perspective in my own research, called The Queer Art of Failure by Jack Halberstam, who I believe is a professor in California. I want to say at Berkeley, probably isn't. I could be completely incorrect about that. But in The Queer Art of Failure, he uses like 6 different Pixar movies and Disney movies and cartoons in general to explain huge concepts that otherwise wouldn't make much sense. But because you're going through that lens of a childish thing that you can watch, you suddenly things make more sense. I mean, we saw that even when Inside Out came out. Psychologists and child psychiatrists were using it to explain things to children in their offices because it boils concepts down into very understandable in understandable ways, so you don't have to read a sentence 6 times in a row just to try to understand it and then say it out loud and still not understand what's going on. You can just watch a little fish swim across an ocean and all of a sudden get these huge concepts about what friendship is, what it means to be a family, what it means to love. Like all of these huge concepts can be boiled down to these very very specific artworks, and
Yeah,
it's a great way to express them. And I think people forget that uh, there's so much conversation around Disney adults lately that it's always made me mad, and I couldn't figure out why. I'm not a Disney adult. I do enjoy Disney stuff, but I'm not someone who has ever wanted to go to Disneyland more than a day at a time every 10 years. It's just a lot, and I get very overwhelmed very quickly. But the conversation around it being so anti-Disney adults, and like, why would you spend so much time there, and why would you care about these little kid things? Like, what's wrong with your life that you would have gone to that place? And it's always made me mad, and I couldn't put my finger on it until I read that book, and I was like, oh, because these are people who identify with these huge concepts and found something that made them feel seen and that they could easily understand, and they don't want to let that go, which is totally understandable and totally fair because they are able to express their own opinions and their own worldviews through those pieces of art.
yeah. I assume you still watch animated stuff from time to time then?
Oh, constantly.
Yeah. I mean, 6 good examples come to mind, but like, have you seen the Wild Robot? Have you seen that one?
No, it's on my list. I just have heard from everyone that they finish watching the movie just sobbing, and I haven't been in a place where I want to let myself go
Just
there
Dob.
yet.
Yeah,
It'll be soon, I promise. It's definitely on my
yeah.
list, but I do
But
I yeah,
but
I've been
yeah,
putting
but
it
even
off.
saying like the sobbing, clearly like these things have like an impact. And for me,
Mhm.
I you know, for example, like I do watch kids movies still, and it's like, oh, you're infantilized. Sure, maybe, fine, whatever. Right? Like, and it's that sense of like, but if I still pick up something out of it, like there, if I'm, I mean, right now I'm doing Thomas Mann short stories. This is, it's a very different experience from, watching the movie. But hey, sometimes you can get a more profound understanding from, Adventure Time than you're going to get from, uh, to this Thomas Mann from Thomas Mann. So
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
sort
I
of,
mean, there's a reason people love Steven Universe, and there's a reason that people love He-Man. There's a reason why there's people that are excited to go see the new Masters of the Universe movie, and it's because the TV show taught them something when they were kids, and that something has become integral to their lives.
yeah,
Great, great, go for it.
yeah. And that's the other canonical thing. Like when I do my lecture on homelessness, I use two figures. I use Kendrick Lamar and Emmanuel Levinas. And it's that sort of sense where I am equating them. And I mean, there's other figures I could use, like Phil Collins, Think Twice, but I think Kendrick Lamar's song "How Much a Dollar Costs" picks a much more difficult homeless figure to sympathize with, just thus adding power to the song. And then Emmanuel Levinas, that sense of the face, and it worked. Those two, his philosophy and that song work really, really well together. And it's like, okay, you're doing that in an intro class, yes. And it's like, what? But it's that sense of like we assume oftentimes that certain material just can't be understood by an intro group. And it's like, no, one of the things that like media can be very good for is the exact thing you're saying. It's like Soul does a great job of having, people like understand like karma, meaning, purposefulness, and like, what one ought to do with their lives, right? Like that Soul is an existentialist film. And it's not really a kid's film per se, but like you could give it to a middle
Not at
schooler
all.
and it's like, and you could give it to a middle schooler and it's like, okay, they can start to get something. And then you give it to a high
Mhm.
schooler, they can really start to click with it. You give it to a college junior while they're stoned, it's like,
I mean, I think
they
that's
really get
something
it.
in all of the conversations that are going on right now around media literacy. I think that's something that is being forgotten and not talked about is the fact that you can disagree with a movie. And we
Mm-hmm.
come back to that concept of disagreement. Like, you don't, to enjoy a movie, you don't have to like it. There are lots of movies that I don't like that I really enjoyed because they made me think. I wouldn't necessarily watch them again, but they made me think and they made me come away with a different viewpoint. And there are movies that I really didn't enjoy, but I did like like
Yeah.
movies that were completely contrary to everything I believe, but they were made so well that I was like, yeah, I like that movie. It was very well made. I honestly kind of feel that way about most Christopher Nolan movies. Like, yeah, that was beautifully made. You're a great director. I hated every minute of it.
For me, that was Hacksaw Ridge, where it's like I hate Mel Gibson's portrayal of the Japanese, and like that was a mess. But like there is still in that movie, there's still that sense of like because I'm very much pacifistic in my thinking, and so that sense of like
Mhm.
to be a to be a pacifist in the midst of violence is an inspiring message, and I think it was outside of how he portrays the Japanese, was portrayed, pretty well. And so it's that sense there, like, yeah, but you don't have to agree with every aspect. Like, ooh, I don't like how the Japanese are racialized here, but or ethnicized here, but
And
that sort of message.
I think that's one reason also why the whole Barbenheimer thing really took off is they were both highly philosophical movies presented in very different ways. And so they
Oh yeah.
complemented each other because you could get people having conversations about the philosophy in the two movies, but attracting themselves to different ways of thinking. Like, I personally enjoyed Oppenheimer's philosophy a lot more than Barbie's philosophy, but Barbie was a lot easier to watch. Wasn't as long and it was a little bit more obvious with its philosophy, but I think that's why that combination of movies, because they've been trying to do that again. They try to find two movies that are coming out the same day and are like, oh, well, they're linked like Barbenheimer. It's like, no, that one was special because it was two movies about philosophy that sparked a lot of conversation. and
And weirdly
it
enough,
worked.
it was the way that those movies were engendered that like when couples start to be like,
Mm.
all right, I'll go see your movie, you'll go see mine, and then each enjoying the other's movie and like really start to like help take that off. Because because I had friends clowning me for seeing the Barbie movie and enjoyed it. I'm like, no, like it did a decent
It
job
was
at
a
like
fun
some
movie.
yeah, it did some like first, second wave feminist stuff. Like it was like a how do you do first and second wave feminism for teenagers, and it does a decent job. And I think the thing that it did it very well because it's like oh this movie hates on men. No, it doesn't. Like the a lot of the point of that movie is like hey like with like the Barbies aren't very nice to the Kens early on, right? Like there's some sense of like toxic femininity going on there. So it's like part of the message of that movie is like how do we, when you over raise or over empower a certain gender, almost like Susan Oken's like concern. No, not yeah, not Oken. Sorry, I'm missing up. I'm messing up my feminist scholars because Oken's the one has issues with multiculturalism. But different scholar, right? So, Crivesta, there we go. When Crivesta is concerned about like, feminist, feminine domination, right? In that same sort of way. So like the part of the movie that the thing about Barbie is like that whole film is about like authenticity. And like that's a message that is a nearly universalist message. I mean, not that authenticity always goes the same way. I mentioned Heidegger earlier, but clearly his authenticity was not good to put it mildly. But still, that in like in that sort of sense there, and then for those who were willing to go through Oppenheimer, I mean that very sort of like philosophical dilemma of like how our choices and action could have been different in like another reality in another frame. That's the ultimate message to me. I will spoil Oppenheimer here, right? Where Robert Downey
If
Jr.'s
you don't
character
know
is like, oh,
history, it's a spoiler.
yeah. It's like, oh, they must be talking about me. They must be talking about me. And the guy in the room's going, oh no, they're talking about much more important things than you. And they're literally talking about like, hey, what if in like a Schrodinger like situation, we did actually destroy the atmosphere? That sense of like in like we destroyed
Yeah.
like another universe's whole atmosphere. Like that, and these sorts of things are like, yeah, very uh different philosophical issues nonetheless, but both, ask the same fundamental question of what do we do with our actions? What do we do with our choices? What do we do, with
And how
our
do our
lives?
choices affect other people?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, I could talk about that for hours because that's that's my favorite thing to discuss. But unfortunately, I don't want to I mean, we could do a 3-part episode, but that wouldn't be fair to the the listeners. So we'll take this opportunity to pivot to the synthesis questions. This is a series of 7 questions that I ask all of my guests. Don't think too hard about the answers, just whatever comes to mind first. So the first question is, what is your typical executive dysfunction and or rest day activity?
I don't rest.
Yeah.
I
If
hate
you
resting.
did, what would you do?
Oh, if I paddleboarding, which is not very
Ooh,
restful, but paddleboarding.
okay, interesting. What is your favorite setting for working on your research?
Paddleboarding, I kid you not. You just out on the Biscayne Bay or out on one of the alligator infested canals in Florida and just thinking about
I don't think I can handle alligators just being in the water. I can
I
barely
mean yeah
handle
you go out on
fish
the
being in
Biscayne
water that
Bay.
I'm.
Yeah, Biscayne we have crocodiles, we have sharks, what else do we have that would be of any issue? That's about it. Just the but on the and sea turtles and dolphins and stingrays and that's nice.
I mean, weirdly, sharks scare me less than dolphins do, and that's just because I went too deep in learning how dolphins interact with humans. um What is one thing an
Not
advisor
always
has told
nicely.
you that has stuck with you? Yeah.
So when I was at UCF, I had a doc. Well, he's a doctor, but like a professor who specialized in sub-Saharan African history, and he pulled me aside, writer. You just need to down, slow down and organize for just 2 seconds, and you'll be fine. And so, yeah, that was like a very helpful piece of advice from Dr. Walker. Shout out to him. I would argue UCF's best professor, make him the head of the school or something.
If you could choose any other area of research, what would you choose and why?
I probably if so I've always said to like family and friends and stuff that if I were better at mathematics, I would have studied evolutionary biology.
Ooh. Yeah, I don't have a brain for math either. It just doesn't. That's not a
Add up.
language that makes sense to me.
Yeah, so you just
Who
subtracted that from your life.
exactly?
Yeah.
Who is one other academic whose research you really admire?
Oh, do they have to be alive?
No.
So I'm going to can I give an independent researcher if that's all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I've mentioned him a lot in like little things I've done, like just conversations and stuff. But one, Punished Felix, he is a YouTuber that like publishes essays, and a lot of his work is at the crossroads of disability, uh, game design, and schizoanalysis. So, and he's a very
Ooh.
good writer. So not always someone I fully agree with, like, but about like 90% of the time, like really interesting stuff that he's doing. And I think the independence of his work has allowed him to focus. And his work is mainly centered around Felix Guattari. So not even Deleuze. He's like a Guattari stan, which there's like two of them, and he's like the second.
Video games are also another really good place to find philosophy in action. So I totally get that. Um, what is a question you've never been able to answer? And I know that's a dangerous question to ask a philosopher.
Well, no, I'm an agnostic, so the question of God is like a big one. It's like, what do you think of God? Well, that's my go-to for sure.
That's fair. Yeah, I am also now an agnostic in that I believe that it's not a question that we can answer. So like I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about it. um
There.
and and then last question, what font do you wish you could present your research in?
I mean, just for the meme, it'd have to be Comic Sans. Just Comic Sans. Just,
Just
just,
to
just,
throw that wrench in the spanner.
yeah, just like here you go, just comics. I should honestly, I've never done a slideshow in Comic Sans, and I should just do it and not mention anything, and just annoy that one student who wants to say something but can't. It's a very legible font, so it wouldn't have any accessibility issues. So
Yeah,
just I should do Comic Sans for a slide and just
just
be
one day.
just yeah, just
Yeah.
one day. I have some topics I need to build up, so I think I'm gonna do Comic Sans for sure.
And then where can people find you online?
Uh, just Google my full name, Anthony David Vernon, and I don't really have a hub anymore for stuff. I thought that was too ego based. So instead, just I'm dispersed. I'm just out there in the ether. So just Google or YouTube or whatever my full name, Anthony David Vernon, and I'm the guy that should come up first. And if there's some other Anthony David Vernon, well, good for them, and hopefully they get some positive attention coming their way.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the
Thank you.
podcast. And thank you to everyone for listening and have a wonderful day. Bye.
Adios.
A huge thank you again to Anthony David Vernon for being a guest on the pod. I really hope you all enjoyed this conversation. I know I did. I always enjoy talking about philosophy from different directions. I also really enjoy talking about how we can make our education systems better. I'm so sorry, but it's a flawed system, and we have a long way to go. So I feel like these conversations can really help us get where we need to go to make sure that all students have what they need to succeed not only in academia but also in the rest of their lives. So, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. If you would like to submit your questions, you can do that via Instagram at hypothesispod. You can email us at podcasthypothesis@gmail.com. That's podcasthypothesis@gmail.com. You also can submit audio questions to us at speakpipe.com/hypothesis podcast. That's speakpipe.com/hypothesis podcast. And you can hear your voice on the podcast and probably be part of one of our new smaller episodes that are starting to come out. So I look forward to hearing your questions and seeing how we can get our listeners involved in the podcast, not just listening. As always, you can find all of the articles discussed in today's episode on our Substack. That's iramcintosh.substack.com. iramcintosh.substack.com. Please follow all of our socials on Instagram. That's at hypothesispod and at Ira A. McIntosh. On TikTok, that's at hypothesispod and at the gay ethnographer. You can also find us on YouTube if you would like to watch us. Just search up the gay ethnographer or just type in hypothesis podcast. You'll get there. I believe in you. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share with your friends. There's no way to grow the community unless you are sharing with your friends. So thank you for doing that so far, and let's see where this podcast can take us, because this information is unnecessary if we're not going to share it. So thank you for being a part of this community. Let's fight misinformation together. Have a wonderful day and go read a book. Bye.